Welcome back to Full Stack WPF. Last episode we set up our domain model, we set up our database, now we're going to talk to it. Before we do that, I actually want to clean up this DB context. So as you see down here, we just have our connection string hard-coded, and I really want to pass that in through the constructor so that we can swap it out, use our DB context against different databases if we need to. So to do that, we are going to generate some constructors. And we're just going to override one of the base constructors of DbContext, which takes in DbContext options, which is exactly what this is. Kinda. This is a builder. If you put options at the end, you get the options. So that's what we're going to do. So we have this constructor. I'm actually going to move it down here underneath my properties. And it's not going to have anything in it, because the base class will take care of all that. Now, to pass this in, you might be thinking, alright, well, when we migrate the database, how is it going to get the connection string? Well, to do that, with Entity Framework, you can create a new class. Call this the design time DbContext options factory. And what happens with this is, whenever you run migrations, Entity Framework will look for this class that will inherit or implement, I believe it's design time DbContext factory, and it's generic. It takes your DbContext. Hopefully I have this right. There we go. So whenever you run migrations, it'll use the DbContext that you create here. So this is where we're going to store our connection string for now. So we're going to create some DbContext options. I think we're going to have to make the builder first. So like that. We're going to have to import some things. So DbContext options builder. And then let's go back here. We're going to grab all this big old connection string. We can get rid of this onConfiguring method. Go back here, paste that in, tell our options to use SQL Server, and then we can return our DB context that is going to use those options. And there we go. So we have that set up. And let's just delete our database and try running this, make sure everything migrates well. So let's go back here. Alright, so I'm going to delete this database. And what else do I need to do? I think we're good to go. Oh yeah, let's delete our migrations too. Might as well. So we're going to add migration initial. Gotta switch to startup project. Don't forget that. Oh, gotta switch to default project. Don't forget that. Alright, so we got our migration. Let's update database. There we go. The migration is done. We can go in here. Let's give this a refresh. And there's our database. All the tables, everything's good. And we no longer have this connection string jammed inside of this inside of this DB context. We can pass it in. We can swap it out whenever we need to. Real quick, I named this design time DB context options factory. That's kind of a bad name because it's not creating DB context options. It's actually creating the DB context. So let's get rid of this options at the end. And you know what? I'm gonna actually rename this SimpleTrader DB Context Factory. I'm very particular about my naming. I want it to be explicit. Alright, let's get this party started. Let's create our data service for Entity Framework. So we're going to create a new folder here called Services. And we'll add a new class, and we will call this Generic Data Service. And what this class is going to do is it's actually going to be generic. It's going to implement our iData service. But the thing about this class is it's going to handle all of our CRUD operations for all of our domain objects. And we're going to be able to handle this all in one class. So we're not going to be writing a bunch of data services for CRUD operations for every single domain object that we have. We can all just do it in this generic data service. Alright, so let's start filling out this class, filling out these CRUD operations. So a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll create a field up here, be a read-only field, and it'll just be their DB context, and they'll use this context, they'll do a bunch of DB operations, get your accounts, all that stuff. But what I want to do is I don't want to actually have this context up here. What I want to do is I want to pass in my DB context factory. And the reason I want to do that is in each of these methods, I want to create a DB context for each operation. I don't want to use the same context for all of these operations, because one thing about Entity Framework's DB context is it's not thread safe. So if multiple threads are trying to use this DB context at the same time, you're going to face some funky things, you might get exceptions. So we're going to use our DB context factory to create a new context for each operation. So this really isn't that difficult. All we really want to do is just pass in a SimpleTraderDbContext factory instead, and we'll name this context factory. And then we'll also pass this through the constructor. Alright, very nice. So now we can fill out this class using our DB context. So first thing I want to do with create is, actually I really want to make all of these async, because again, I don't want to be blocking the UI when we call these methods. So all these can be async. And then for create, I'm going to make these operations are actually very simple. This is going to be a pretty concise class, but we're going to be doing using SimpleTraderDbContext, context equals our context factory, create DB context. And actually what I did, I haven't shown this, but I gave this a default parameter of null, because we're not actually using these args, and I don't want every single caller of this function to have to pass in null. So we create our SimpleTraderDbContext, and using that context, what we're going to do is we're going to await with the context. We're going to add async. Or actually, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to use set. And with set, what we do is we can pass in this t argument, and it'll give us the DB set for this t. So if t, say, was an asset transaction, what it would do is it would give us this DB set for asset transactions. And that's basically what allows us to make this entire class generic, and we don't have to have a data service for each entity. So we get the set, and what we're going to do is we're going to add async, the entity that gets passed into the method, and we actually get an error here. So t must be a reference type. Basically all that means is we need to have a constraint on t, so we can say where t is a class, and a class is of course a reference type, and all of our domain objects are also classes, so this is fair game right here. So we add our entity to the DB context, and then all we have to do is say context.save changes async. I'm not actually doing any error handling here, or checking like if it's successful. I just want to run through the basics here and get something out there, and we'll handle the error handling probably, I don't know, maybe at the end of this episode. But it's going to be important. So we have our create, and create actually returns an entity. So we're going to return the entity that gets created. I think that Entity Framework will give it an ID field when we call this add async. I'm not entirely sure. We might have to see, what does this actually return? Okay, we can say it returns an entity. Yeah, that's what we want to do. So we want to say new entity. Call this new, what, I don't know, like created entity. And then we'll just say created entity dot entity. We're gonna have to test all this out and make sure it works. Feeling pretty good about it though. Alright, let's move on to delete. We're just gonna copy all this, get the using statement copied. And this one's gonna be a little bit funky, okay? So what I wanna do is first we need to find the entity. Because we're only passing in the ID, we're not passing in the entire entity. So let's say T entity equals, we're going to use our concept, we're going to use our DB set, and we're going to say first or default async, and in here we're going to pass in what we're looking for. So we're looking for E, where the entity's ID. What's going on here? Okay, I need to import this. So using entity framework core. So we're looking for the first entity where, and this is where we face issues. We really want the first entity where the ID is going to equal ID, but we have no way of knowing if this T even has an ID field. So this is simple to fix. All we have to do is go back to our domain model, and we're going to create a new class called domain object. And domain object, all it's going to have is a field or a property called ID. And then all of our domain objects are going to inherit from domain object, and they're going to use the ID field on domain object instead of their own ID field. So basically we can ensure that each of our domain objects have an ID field. So we can add it to user, we can add it to asset transaction, but we're actually not going to add it to stock because stock doesn't actually have its own database table. It doesn't have an ID field. And then with that, we can put a constraint on T where instead of it having to be a class, we want it to be a domain object. And then we ensure that each T that gets passed into this class will have an ID field. So back to this first or default, we can get the first entity where the ID equals the ID that's passed in. So we retrieve the entity, and now we want to use our set to remove this entity. Then we save changes, and we can just return true because we have no error handling right now. But again, I just want to get the CRUD operations out there, and we'll handle the error handling after that. So now our get method is actually going to be very similar. I'm going to copy all of that, and instead of removing what we find, we're just going to return it. It's pretty simple there. Now get all. Whoops. I'm going to copy all this again. Always got to be careful with copy paste, but we should be good. And for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, instead of first or default async, I'm going to say to list async. And that'll give us all the entities in this set, but we're not going to return a T of entity. We're going to say I enumerable of T. And then we'll return all the entities. And then last but not least, we have update. We're going to copy this one. So with update, what we're going to do is we're going to take the entity that's passed in. Let me get rid of all this junk. We're going to take the entity that's passed in, and we're going to set its ID to this ID parameter. Because what we're doing is we're updating the current saved entity in the database with the ID of ID, and we're setting all of its values to whatever gets passed into this entity. So basically to do that, we just set the ID of this entity to be this ID. So this is the new value, and all we have to do is say, or use our context, get our set, and we're going to update entity. And that's not actually async for some reason. I'm not actually sure why, but either way, when we save, that'll be async. And then we're just going to return the new entity. So that is all of our CRUD operations. I don't actually like using var, but this is an entity entry of t. And then I feel like created entity is the wrong name for this. We're going to call this created result because it's not actually the entity. The entity is stored in this. But yeah, that cleans it up a little bit. I wanted to create like a unit test project, run some unit tests, integration tests, all that. But this video is getting a little bit long, so we'll save that for another video. So all I'm going to do to make sure this works is just throw in a console app, and let's just run through some things. We're going to create a iData service for the user domain object, and we're just going to call it user service equals new generic data service of user, and it's just going to take a new SimpleTraderDbContext factory, and then we gotta add a bunch of references. Add reference, import some more. Alright, so we have our user service, and what we're going to say is user service.create new user. Give it a username of test, and then we're going to say wait so that it finishes. Alright, so let's set this as the startup project, and let's give it a go. Alright, let's look at our users table, and we have a user. So we have so it looks like create is working. Let's do user service dot get all dot, let's get the result of that, and then we're gonna get a count of how many users are returned. Now I need to write that out to the console. This is actually a method. There we go. So we should get a 1 because we have one user in the database. There we go. I did see a 1. Maybe I should put a console read line here so we can see the results and everything. So get all is working. Let's do like a get by ID. Pass in, I think the ID is 1. So if we run this, we don't actually have a toString on our user objects, but we should see a bunch of stuff that shows that the user gets oh, we didn't get anything. Oh, the ID is 2, okay. What the heck? How did that happen? There we go, okay. Oh, so that get all method, that was the count, that wasn't the ID. I don't know why I thought that was the ID. So get is working. Let's do a little update. We'll say, I'm gonna update 2. For some reason it's 2. Maybe because I had stuff in the database before. But anyways, we're gonna update user2. We're going to give it a username of test user. Alright, let's refresh that. We have test user, and now let's just do a delete. And it should remove it from the database. There we go. Nice. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. So we cleaned up our DB context, we introduced a DB context factory to create our DB context and pull this connection string into its own little self-contained factory method. And then we set up our generic data service. We tested that a little bit. Still gonna add some error handling, you know, like what if we don't find the entity when we try to delete it? What if we return null when we get all those kinds of things, but we'll handle those in a future episode. And thank you guys for watching. If you have any suggestions for this series, please leave a comment. If you have any criticisms for this series, if you don't like what I'm doing, leave a comment as well. But anyways, thank you guys for watching.